I do remember being told as an associate, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I remember looking back at someone and saying, well, that's not going to work for your people of color here because we have been taught to not be the squeaky wheel.
Welcome to The Defense Never Rests with Morgan and Akins, your monthly dose of uncommon sense about all things legal and some that are not.
Hey everybody, this is Trisha Baxter. Welcome back to The Defense Never Rests. Super excited about today's episode. We're talking diversity and inclusion. And it's going to be very interesting to talk about that in the context of what's going on with us being isolated and quarantined and not in our office. So I'm interested to get that take from our guests today. Before we get into it, I just want to say, if you like what we are doing, hit that subscribe button. That'll push that podcast onto your feed so you can be sure to get the next episode. And give us a 5-star rating and review. We super appreciate the support. I'm so excited about our guest today. She is a diversity and inclusion professional. She works with law firms to help bring in diversity and inclusion. I'm going to just repeat myself. Alexis Robertson. Hey, Alexis, how are you?
Great. Happy to be here, meaning to break up the monotony of being in my house.
I know, right? We actually get to talk to each other and see each other. So we actually met kind of on LinkedIn. I came across your feed because you were very active on LinkedIn. I love your mission. It's really to help law firms solve this problem, for lack of a better word. I don't know if that's the right word. So let's get into it. Let's start with what exactly is a diversity and inclusion professional? What do you do?
We are people who are paid to focus on diversity, inclusion, and then you can add in equity, you can add in belonging, but specifically in my role, so I'm actually the director of diversity and inclusion at Foley and Lardner, which is I think at this point an AmLaw 50 law firm. But what I focus on is the retention, recruitment, and promotion of diverse attorneys. And typically what comes to mind when you're thinking of the population that I most focus on, it's women, it's ethnic minorities, it's the LGBT community, and also people with disabilities, veterans, and then those categories are always expanding. So oftentimes we're not now even speaking about first generation Americans and so on, but basically people who have been othered. We're focused on making our organizations have demographics that more closely resemble society at the end of the day. And we do that through a variety of means.
So before we get into the variety of means, which I think is probably going to be the bulk of the episode, tell me about your story. How did you become a diversity and inclusion professional?
So it started with me being a lawyer. I'm still a licensed attorney actually, but I went to the University of Michigan for law school. I graduated, was a litigation associate at Kirkland & Ellis for about 6 years. I then changed and became an employment lawyer at Seyfarth Shaw for a bit, but this underlying thread for me was I'd always had this interest in employment, or at least I thought employment, but really what I was most interested in was people. And adding, 10, 12 years to that, particularly human connection. So after 7.5 years of practice, I left and I became a legal recruiter, which is actually one of the reasons why I'm so active on LinkedIn. That made me comfortable on LinkedIn a couple years before others were comfortable there. But even in that role, I was very focused on how I connected with my candidates, how I connected with the companies I was working with, because my job was placing lawyers with law firms and corporations, but ultimately I ended up being focused on placing diverse lawyers with law firms and corporations. After doing that for a few years, I was recruited into a dedicated D&I or diversity and inclusion role at Baker McKenzie, did that for a couple of years, and then recently joined Foley and Lardner. So in many ways, my path it's felt a bit serendipitous, but a part of that for me was being a woman of color, being a Black woman in a very large law firm where you inevitably end up doing some diversity and inclusion work. So in a lot of ways, I do the work to represent the interests that I wanted represented when I was still practicing law.
Can you talk about your experience as a woman of color, being a lawyer for those 7.5 years? I'm going to have to just assume that you had your challenges because you're a woman and a woman of color. Can you talk about what those were?
Well, what's really interesting, and it's going to sound Pollyanna-ish because I'm very aware of the multiple barriers that really anybody who's other feels, but especially Black attorneys, frankly, and that's something we should talk a bit about because in all the numbers, Black lawyers are the least represented. But for me, I didn't have many experiences where I felt that I was specifically left out because of my race or gender. I will say, so my kids are now 6 and 8 years old, and when I had children as an associate in a large law firm, that was certainly a vote for my time. And I'm also unable to talk, to talk about the things that I, wasn't invited to, that I didn't know about. So I'm certain there are things that have occurred, but in terms of pointing to a specific instance of someone said X to me because of my status as a woman or a Black woman, I don't have that. But I do think what happens, even for someone like me who can't point to these discrete, perhaps intentional instances, is that certainly implicit bias plays a role. So I won't know what calls I didn't get, for example, right? Because, this kind of stereotype that often how it plays out is people are just comfortable with people who are like them. So, Joe Smith, the associate, he really reminds me of me, and he went to the same law school, and he does really great work. And so I just call Joe whenever I have an assignment. He's 2 offices down from me. So I don't know how often that played out, but what I do see is that often people of color in particular, but women, it goes across the board, have to work more for those assignments. So to the extent that happened in my career, I'm sure it did. I don't have like a really succinct example of it, but for me, I also really found the challenge of being a mother while being a junior associate difficult as well, because there's only so many hours in the day, and some of that time ends up having to go to your kids. So that's I'm kind of all over the place there, but I don't have kind of a couple anecdotes to share, but I know it was playing in the background.
And that's kind of my experience too, is I have the woman part. I obviously don't have the woman of color. I'm as Caucasian as you can be, but I definitely had the comments, right? We've all had the comments that, about how we looked or whatever it may be, but the comments that are more of the sexist, derogatory kind, we've all had those, I think. I can't point to one example where I felt like I was held back, but I know for sure that there were clients that I don't think wanted to work with me versus the male associates. I know that kind of stuff, but none of the stuff that I experienced held me back. Or at least I don't feel like it held me back. I'm managing 3 offices right now. I love my position right now. So I can't look back and say, oh, woe is me. I've been practicing for 20 years. I've had a pretty good run. So,
It's hard. It's hard because you really don't know. But when I look back, there's certain things I think that I'm more professionally comfortable now. Part of that is just getting older. So you add in these layers, you add in gender, you add in ethnicity, of course you also add in age. So I went straight through law school. I had 2 weeks off between undergrad and law school because Michigan started a class in the summer. I was already young to begin with. I think I graduated from law school when I was 24. I remember turning 5 while I was a first year at Kirkland. And there's dynamics to being 24, 25 years old, trying to relate to a 55, 60-year-old partner, whether they be good or bad, where it was much harder for me to assert myself, where that person could look at me and be like, I think she's the age of my daughter, and we certainly have that come up. And it's tough for me because I don't want to discount the level of whether it be systemic discrimination, intentional, overt, implicit, whatever. There's a lot going on by the mere fact that I'm not able to point to something really specific. But like I said, I know this plays in the background, I think for everyone to some degree.
Yeah. So can we talk, and maybe you know the stats on this, maybe you don't. I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I kind of am. Do you happen to know, how bad is it when you're talking about Black lawyers or members of the LGBT community? How bad is it at the leadership level?
Oh, the stats are not good at all. And they haven't changed for a very long time. But most recently, NALP came out with their 2019 report. Or maybe it's 2020, but analyzing 2019. And one of the big headlines was Black lawyers have exceeded their pre-recession levels. And one thing that I vividly remember is when you dug in, it wasn't Black lawyers. It was, fortunately, Black male lawyers have had increases. Black women lawyers are still not at the pre-recession levels of 2008. And I believe at the partner ranks, you see Black women as 0.6%. So as in less than 1%. That's now pre-recession. I think it was 0.7. And
before recession, it was 0.7.
Yeah. I think now it's like 0.64, something like that. And these are publicly available, stats. People can grab these, and I'm always happy to be corrected, because the thing is, even if I'm a little off, whatever it is, it's abysmal. And I think women of color total between all women of color are maybe in the 2 to 3% range at the top law firms. Maybe like say the AmLaw 200 law firms. The stats are bad. And like it's interesting to be in this line of work, because we talk about stats a lot. We look at demographics a lot, and frequently you're maybe presenting your firm with their statistics compared to the market. And I'm always reminding people, if or when we're exceeding what the general, law firm numbers look like, we cannot pat ourselves on the back, because the numbers are abysmal. So for instance, I think on average, you'll see women comprising right now, it's around 20%, maybe closer to 25, but I don't think we're quite there yet, of equity partners in large law firms. It's predominantly white women. And, given that women are, I think, actually more than half the population,
and more than half the population of law schools. So I think it's
right. Right. So the numbers aren't great, but frankly, the success stories we see are predominantly among white women. And so as a D&I professional, that's something that's also interesting, because we do need to, be tracking all sorts of metrics, take success when we can get it, and point out here's where we are achieving our goals. But oftentimes in D&I, we will point to the story of women, but really what we're talking about is white women in terms of the progress within making it to equity partner.
So, and are women of color going to law school? I mean, we're not talking about 0.6% of law students being.
Yeah. Well, what you see is they will opt out and go to government or go in-house. And that's the other thing. And it's such a nuanced discussion to have, because like I said, if you just say women, well, okay, who are we talking about as women? But women of color are more likely to be the primary breadwinners in their household. So then often the first thought will be, oh, well, women just opt out because they're having babies and they're staying at home. And that is not at all the narrative for women of color. So there's other things going on. And what we see is an ever diversifying in-house counsel. They are becoming diverse faster than their law firm counterparts. And that is certainly a part of the reason why we're seeing, clients pushing for diversity within their outside counsel, because they're diverse.
I was going to say as more women of color and other, am I saying that right? Do I
Yeah.
just say other? Okay.
And others, I don't know.
And
Keep
others.
going.
Okay. As more women that's such an interesting point you made. As women of color and other minorities make their way into positions of in-house counsel and power, then they get to influence the private
Absolutely.
law firms.
Spend. Yeah, they're influencing spend. And one of my jobs, which I didn't even touch on, or one of the aspects of my job, is the client-facing component. Whether it be, making sure that we have materials that show our focus on diversity and inclusion so the client can see what we're doing, but also talking with the partners at my firm so that they feel, confident and comfortable reviewing, exactly what it is that their organization is doing to pursue D&I, or at the very least, making sure they know that I am at the firm and that I can attend these meetings, because there is a large client-facing dynamic of diversity and inclusion, particularly at large law firms.
So I think it's also interesting that you have this position carved out, not you, but there is this position
role
carved out that you see starting to really spread in the large law firms, but it
Yep.
is not in the smaller to medium-sized law firms,
Mhm.
at least that I'm seeing. And maybe it's an economic thing. Maybe they
Yep.
can't afford a pure overhead, non-timekeeper situation. So I really want to talk to the people that don't have you and in their office next door or in their meetings. And I want to go to why is this important? I've seen you post before that we've largely moved past the why and are now focused on the how. But I do want to back up and talk about why is diversity and inclusion important in law firms?
Yeah, there's so many angles, right? So I'm used to, I can talk about the moral reasons of it's the right thing to do. I can talk about the business case, which the really great research has come out of McKinsey. They've had a couple of reports really looking at how organizations that are diverse are more profitable. You reach better outcomes. And the thing is, if you have different perspectives, of course, you're going to have a better resolution. And so if you have a diverse group of people, what the research shows is they may take a little bit longer to reach the solution of whatever problem you've provided them, but it will be a better solution. And so as lawyers, when we are charged with providing our clients with solutions to complex problems, you really benefit from a variety of perspectives. But even setting that aside, and there's a lot of research about that. So I think if you just Google McKinsey and diversity matters, you'll come up with not only the detailed research reports, but it's McKinsey. So they also do the summary report for those who don't want to read the 50-page report. But for me, in a lot of ways, it also comes down to talent management, and because you are dealing with people, and it's also a huge leadership issue. If you look at the ranks of your organization and the only people you appear to resonate with look one way, you have a leadership problem. You have a people problem. I would submit you are not good with human beings. You are good with a type of human, and that is problematic. And that is something that you should endeavor to fix. But also a lot of talent management, things that are just like best practices in talent management, those are also going to really impact your diverse attorneys. So what you'll also see are organizations with really severe diversity problems have at their core also have talent management problems that need to be addressed. So in some ways it's a matter of, what is it, a rising tide raises all boats, where if you can make things better for everyone, oftentimes that'll go a long way for diverse populations as well.
So let's dive a little deeper into that. And I do want to back up to the profitable one, because I feel like that's gets a lot of people's attention.
Absolutely.
And I do think that's so important. So, for me as a litigation attorney, part of my job is predicting human behavior. Like I represent companies when they get sued, usually in the personal injury front, and we're in front of juries, we're in front of judges, we're in front of mediators. And I have to tell them when a case comes in, this is what a jury and a judge or a mediator is going to think about your case. I don't know how you do that if you come at it from one perspective.
Absolutely.
So, and how do I value pain and suffering? How do I tell my client, this is what a jury is going to put a number on? This is what they're going to give the plaintiff in terms of money, if I don't pull in different perspectives? So
it's a liability if you don't.
Yeah.
Huge liability.
Yeah. If I'm only bouncing ideas off of white women or white men or the same type of person, and that goes to socioeconomical stuff
Absolutely.
too.
Absolutely.
Then I'm not doing my job. So I get that solutions part. And I hope that most law firms do as well. What's your experience when you talk to them about diversity from you get a more well-rounded solution?
So I think most people are open to that, and the research is really, really strong there. And it does make sense, particularly to the litigators, right? As you were just saying. And for me, having been an employment lawyer for a while, when you lack, for example, ethnic diversity and you litigate discrimination cases, you have an issue because you are likely not able to have as nuanced of a view at it, frankly. So having been an employment litigator, it made a lot of sense to me. Just for example, if I'm doing a race discrimination case, to have people of different races, and it's multi-leveled, right? All the way down one to the optics. Do you want the optics of the two older white men sitting at the table, and at the other table, the plaintiff's table is, for example, the black woman alleging discrimination? Just the dynamics there don't look good in front of the jury. But also, as you're exploring this race topic, potentially, not necessarily, but my comfort level in taking the deposition and exploring the impact that the racial slurs that were used is different. The dynamic I bring to that deposition is different potentially than what someone else with differing life experience can bring. And so that is, of course, just one example.
That's a great point. I had never thought about that. You could really probably dive a lot deeper.
And and I've had instances where, like, once again, on a race discrimination case where my view was, no, we cannot shy away from the language that was used here. It will play against us in front of a jury because it makes us look like we're trying to lighten what happened. And if we do have a diverse jury, that is not going to play well with them. If anything, what we need to be is like, here's what happened, but it does not rise to the level of, of whatever damages or whatever it is that the plaintiff is alleging. But there's just so many different things that we each can bring in terms of our perspective. And it's really easy to talk about in the litigation context. Same thing with, like, if you're not familiar with the judge or the venue in which you're in, like, there's certain, whether it be defenses or because you walk in with the wrong accent, say in a Southern courtroom, you're going to be the Northerner trying this case in front of you already have them. And how do people know that? You'd know that from your diversity of experience.
Yeah.
So it's just, and it goes across the board, but there's so many different ways in which this manifests. But I also can't forget that the reason we have a lot of the issues we have are because of systemic, structural, and historical discrimination in the US. So I don't want to discount that either, because we do have it's really nice to bring in people with all kinds of different experiences, but there are certain groups that are underrepresented because they have had the deck stacked against them for literally hundreds of years, right? And so that's the case. That's what we see with ethnic minorities and with women. And so to not take that into account when doing your hiring, when understanding, implicit bias, which frankly boils down to just sheer tribalism in a lot of ways, when making certain talent decisions, is really ignoring the reality of what's going on in the world. And that's what we can't afford to do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the talent management that you said. Dive deeper into that, because I don't quite get my head wrapped around that. What's the problem with the talent management?
So here's an example. And once again, I'll keep picking on law firms because it's the world I know, but I do think other industries have started tackling this better. Work allocation. How is the organization giving work out to its lawyers? Generally speaking, most, generic law firm, it is, I'm a partner, I have a client, I'm going to find an associate to work on this. And when we do that and just allow things to go that way, what happens is frequently bias will, I don't want to say prevail, but will infiltrate, right? Because without being intentional about our biases, they will kind of carry the day. So back to what I was saying about what happens. Well, I'm a big partner with a lot of business. I went to a top 10 law school. So clearly the only associate capable of doing this work went to a top 10 law school. I played X sport. I really just click with this guy who played the same sport that I did. Oh my gosh, and he's from the same hometown as me. Steve needs to do the work for me. Is there anything really malevolent in the way that I've tried to reach that decision? No, it's not because I don't want to work with women or because I have an issue with people of color. It's just that, I click with Steve, he's down the hall. And so for the next 12 years, Steve got my business, right? I groomed him. We went to golf, we'd go to the bar. When Steve's brief wasn't really good, I turned to him and I was like, Steve, your brief is terrible. You need to fix that, right? But I actually did end up having a little bit of other work with some other people. And so, for example, let's say I was working with a woman as well, Sarah's fine. I didn't give her as broad of feedback on her brief because I personally was uncomfortable that she might cry if I told her. And so I'm hoping that she reads the remarks. She's nice enough, but Steve still, that's my guy, who I'm comfortable with. We have these stories play out. And what happens is, with enough time, that is how one group of people will get better work, will get better training, and not necessarily because it's coming from this nefarious place. And then that's how often we see that women and people of color and just those who are other do not. And so ways to deal with that from a talent management perspective would be to have much more intentional work allocation systems.
And we're gonna get to solutions on that, but shortly. But I love that example. It's okay. Suppose you start with a diverse pool of associates. You have maybe a yearly class that comes in. That's not how it works, but let's just say for the hypo that's how it works. You have a yearly class of 20 associates, and it's a really great, diverse, white, black, gay, straight. I mean, whatever other you want to put in there. But then once they're in there, it's how they're managed from there on out.
Yes.
That contributes to the inequities that you see in leadership.
Yes.
Is that what it is?
That's part of it. And even just getting to that diverse class can be difficult because frequently, particularly with underrepresented minorities, they don't have equal access to the top law schools. There's lack of information there. There's obviously financial reasons going on there, but we will use these institutions as proxies for the best, but that's not true. They tend to be proxies for people who knew to apply to Harvard. And actually, Harvard Business Review, I want to say, is a 2015 article. It's titled, "Professional Services Firms Are Wasting Millions Recruiting at Only a Few Schools," for that very reason. So we get happy to take the rest of the hypos given that we managed to get this diverse class, but even getting there can be a challenge because the people at the top schools are very limited in terms of, those who aren't, from back to wealthy, usually white, usually you can just go down the line. So the candidate pool can be very, I call it artificially narrow because lawyers will frequently admit we just don't have the candidate pool. And I'm like, well, you've narrowed the pipeline. You've chosen to breathe out of a straw for some reason. Just take the straw out of your mouth. But, yeah.
And that's one of my questions I have is I imagine that you get that a lot is, well, I just don't get the diverse applicant applying. And I'll say, when I put out an ad, I don't like, and so I'm doing something wrong, and we'll talk about that. But I think that's a great point. But let's go with the hypo for a second.
Yeah.
So let's just say you've been more successful than any other law firm, and you've got, whatever percentages you have, but it's a diverse pool that's coming in. From there on out, it's what you're saying. It needs to be an intentional management issue that you
Absolutely.
have to make sure that the partners divvying up work are giving it out in a way that's fair.
It's across the board. So everything from the work, the way that's distributed, to your review systems, how are they administered, also to your professional development. And those, I say, I'm kind of just making stuff up here, right? But there's a good argument that probably addresses 60 to 80% of issues that you may have. Now, I can't, it's harder to control for some of the more historical, systemic, the personal biases, but I think there's an argument to be made that by having an intentional systems behind the core ways to groom somebody professionally can go a long way versus relying on it to be completely, what's the word? I was going to say grassroots, but there's a better word for that, where you're just kind of like, it'll work out. Everybody's nice here. Like, we give out work. Like, we're really good about making sure that we mentor our associates and pull them aside. And
it's going to happen organically. Right?
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Organically. Totally. Yeah. And the thing is, places with good culture, and I say this hesitantly because you can find really disturbing issues pretty much anywhere. But yeah, when you do have a more human culture, connected culture, oftentimes smaller offices or smaller practice groups, it'll be a little bit easier to address some of these things more organically. But after being in this world for a while, my my hypothesis is that the more we can formalize and have the organization pick up and systematize things so that we don't have as much room for personal preference and bias to pervade, like, we should go ahead and do that. But this is really diversity and inclusion, according to Alexis Robertson. Like, it will take organizations, particularly law firms, given how reticent we are of the industry is to change, I think many, many years to get to this place. And I'm discounting how difficult it can be just organizationally to implement these things. This is time, this is money, this is professional business services staff to do these things. And also we're in COVID-19 right now, dealing with potentially the worst recession, soon to be depression, since the Great Depression. So nobody's in a world of looking to spend more money. But overall, whatever you can do to monitor the way work is doled out, to monitor how people are being trained and to monitor how they're being reviewed, that will go a long way to improve diversity and inclusion within your organization.
And let's talk about the system inside the law firms, how they reward people and what skill sets they are looking for. Traditionally, it's the aggressive lawyer, and in my field, the one who bills the most. And can women of color, different others, or diverse attorneys, can they thrive in that system, or do we need to change the system?
Yeah. So there's so many ways to address that. I would say the system is really difficult on everybody. Like, it truly is. It's very hard to balance all the things that any successful lawyer has to balance. But yeah, because of the things we've been talking about. So I guess, let's focus on women for a bit, because women typically are the ones bearing the brunt of, child rearing. And whether we talk about the time, the intensive amount of time you spend with your children, or just the physical nature of being pregnant for 9 months and then having to recover. And then let's look at how that often corresponds with the partner track, right? Like, right when you should be kind of putting the gas on moving for being promoted to partner, that's often the same time a lot of women are looking at having families. And so I think for sure we all know that is problematic. We have more firms that are trying to do things by say, you are still eligible for partner even if you go part-time. But I do think what we're seeing is the overall business model, which was based on a model of a man working. He had a stay-at-home wife. And also the hours at large law firms have really cranked up in a way that we didn't see, in the 50s or the 60s. So there's so many things at play, but it's hard for me because as much as I think everyone can very easily see some of the problems with the structure of firms themselves, law firms are what raised me. And so I can point out that like the business model is problematic, but I'm also keenly aware that this is the model we have to operate in, at least for right now. So we need to figure out what works within it, because we could say, oh, we should just blow it up and start over. But guess what? No one's doing that tomorrow. So what solutions can we bring to the current system? Because that's what we have to deal with.
And I think it is changing. I think we're in the midst of a change, even though it's like turning the Titanic, like maybe that's a bad example, but turning a very large ship. I think they're starting to turn. I think COVID's going to help with that.
Well, yeah, because suddenly remote work is very accessible.
But I think we are in the midst of that. I think as more women, more parents become in positions of leadership
Yes.
that have gone through the flexible arrangement, that don't see the need to work 80 hours a week to succeed. Because I think that's how I was raised. And I didn't have kids till later. I didn't have my daughter till I was 35, when I already had a significant chunk of legal experience in my belt. So I never went that experience of being a young parent and trying to practice. So I have to say that, right? But I was able to work 12-hour days, and for the first 10 years of my career, and that certainly helped me develop relationships and learn my craft, but that's not the only way to do that. And I think that's changing. I think going the old school, let's bill 2,500 hours a year, which is insane, and let's work 80 hours a week, is slowly starting to fade. I don't want to say a lot, but slowly. And I think as we say, all right, a good solid 40 to 50 hour week, or maybe a 25 to 40 hour week works for you, that you can succeed in that model. And I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think we are seeing more flexibility there. And I'm so happy you're saying that, because sometimes the changes that I see, I wonder if it's because they're changing just my small bubble, right? But I do think also, frankly, with the just well-being and mental health crisis also that we're seeing arise with lawyers, is forcing us to have these discussions and to realize that, this is not good for people. And also, what is our focus? It needs to be much more long-term. Am I focused on getting, X number of hours out of you when it's, really hard for you while you're, juggling your 9-month-old at home? Or, if I can invest in you, we work through this time period where you need more flexibility. At some point, you will have the ability to spend more time at work. But also, we just have to have much more long-term mindset, because people just burn out. I mean, it's not good at all.
And that was me from a personal experience. I hit the 7-year mark and I wanted to quit. Like, I just wanted to get out of law, because I was like, I can't do this. I was waking up at 5. And there was a good stretch of a year that I did this, waking up at 5 a.m., getting in the office at 6. I would do back-to-back deps. Yep. I would then summarize them, get home at 8, and then just repeat the cycle.
You were right on time, though. I call it the 7 to 10 year. I call it the 7 to 10 year itch, but it might be the 7 to 10 year early, like midlife crisis for lawyers, where you've been doing it. It's usually 7 to 12. And I would see this as when I was a recruiter. You've been doing it long enough to know what your future will look like if you stay where you are. And then you hit that, can I keep doing this? Is this what I want? For me, it was, do I even want to stay a lawyer? But that's exactly right. And either you modify things so that you can stay in your profession, or a lot of people leave at that point, frankly.
And I stuck it out, not because I really decided to dedicate myself to the law, but just because I couldn't find another backup. I couldn't find another situation. I'm glad that I did in retrospect, because I love my position now. I would never have been in it if I had taken an alternative route, but I get that mindset. So
yes. Well, but that's also the thing. Being a lawyer is very hard, right? You do not feel competent, I think, until easily 10 years out of law school. It could depend on your practice. It could depend on a lot of things. But what I find then is those who've been practicing for, say, 15 years plus are usually a lot happier, because they've at that point seen a lot. Or as I used to joke, they eventually learned the rule book, and then they knew when they could throw out the rules as well, but they were having a lot more fun in their careers at that point. But that first, 10 to 15 years establishing yourself, it's hard. It's not the same
very
as,
hard.
Someone's, come here, you're going to press this button. Okay, I'm really good at pressing the button. I can do that after 3 months. No, it takes you a decade to start to feel confident.
And I don't ever, if you ever really 100% get to confidence, 100% confident, because you're always learning. But let's talk. I
was just going to say, you hit the point where you get more of a, my guess is as good as anybody else's.
Exactly.
So we're going to do it this way.
Yeah, and you feel confident, even if you're wrong, you're going to be wrong. Like, who cares, right?
It's fine. Yeah.
And that this could be in and itself its own podcast. But I want to see how deep we can dive on it. How do we fix the problem? Let's start with getting more diversity in the funnel of the hiring funnel. How do we do that?
Yeah. So law firms in particular, we should be much more flexible about grade cutoffs and law schools that we recruit from. The initial thought that some will have is, oh, you want us to lower our standards so that we can get women and minorities? Nope, that's not what I'm saying. But what I said earlier, I want everyone to look at, do your standards bear a rational basis to what actually takes to succeed in your organization? We are having more firms start to run analytics to see who are their successful Rainmaker partners. And usually those people are not the top, 10% at Harvard. They tend to be second tier law schools. And so once again, like, really examine, do your criteria make sense? Also, as I said, for those individuals that don't know to apply to the top schools, that don't have a lawyer in their family, what they're going to say is, oh, there's a law school next to my house. I can still work part-time. I can take care of my mom. And that does not mean that they are any less, intelligent or be a successful lawyer. But oftentimes what we're doing is we're actually sorting out people with grit. So if somebody was able to have a B average at, a mid-tier law school while taking care of family and working, I think that's actually a person who's probably going to have the drive and the hustle to be a really great partner. But often so that's kind of my rant about that, is we need to look at our criteria for the people we even recruit into our firms. And then, yes, we need to get very intentional about the way in which work is allocated. We need to look at our professional development. Are there formal trainings that we can have? Are we relying, and this is of course for the larger firm, unfortunately, that does have the resources. So I'll say a few words about the smaller firms after, but do we have formal mechanisms to provide our attorneys with skills? Or are they having to be reliant on informal ways, which more so is going to mean, did someone really take interest in you and then tell you how to take a deposition? And then ultimately looking at our review process and procedures. There can be a lot of things in there that can negatively impact diverse individuals based on how you do the review. Sometimes there's some kind of coded language back to, the woman was bossy, but the man was, aggressive in a positive way, that kind of thing. But I think for organizations that don't, necessarily have, and by the way, remember, even the organizations that have people like me are still struggling with this. So it's not necessarily a given, but I think being really wise about your people, about your talent, and doing things that make life easier and more equitable for them. So for a lot of organizations, diversity and inclusion ends up being more of an HR function, whereas I don't sit with an HR, I'm kind of a separate thing. But even there, you can look at your review system. How do you solicit feedback? Are there reminders you could give in advance of the review that would help, to maybe neutralize some of the subjective nature? And I don't even want to go along deep into reviews because that could take us forever. But similarly in interviewing, how do you conduct your interviews? Do you have a standard set of interview questions that everybody should ask? Or do you just have people walk in and the lawyer does the thing where they're turn from their computer, be like, hold on, let me find your resume. And then they say, tell me about yourself. While they look and they're like, oh, I also went to UVA for law school. So how fair is that?
I'm so
process?
guilty of that too. So I'm like, no.
I mean, and it's funny because in some ways I don't mind it. I'm great at interviewing because I know most lawyers don't do real interviews. They just talk about just make the lawyer feel good about themselves. They'll hire you, but things like that. So there's often little sort of prompts, bias interrupters that can be built in at different stages. So like I said, for the place that can't have a whole diversity and inclusion department, okay, pick a thing to start with. Let's look at the way we do interviews. Okay, we're going to ask that each person here at least ask these 5 questions of a candidate so that we have these 5 answers to compare, so that we're not just comparing whether or not the candidate also liked football.
Well, so let's talk specifically to the small law firm or the medium-sized law firm like us, that I'll be honest to say our diversity sucks. I mean, we could be doing so much better. I don't know how to do better. Fundamentally, I know it starts with the hiring process. I feel like I'm pretty good at the inclusion part, but I don't hire well. Not that I don't hire well, but I don't get ethnic people in my door, and I know that I'm doing something wrong. How does the small law firm, because listen, our we throw up ads in the legal intelligence or the local papers, the online systems, and I actually don't have set forth requirements for schools,
Yeah.
or because I didn't come from Harvard, and I like grit. I like that. I want to hire grit and persistence and preparation over smarts. I think that
And
wins the day every day.
do you end up, of the hires you make, do a number of them tend to be referrals, or are they based on people who've applied?
It's a great question. I think good half of them are referrals. We've used headhunters for others. And I've told the headhunters, I want diverse candidates.
Yeah.
And, it's funny because one headhunter said, you mean you want someone from coverage and auto? I'm like, no. That's not what I mean by diverse. I mean, ethnically, their background diverse.
Well, and so that recruiter obviously didn't get it. I will say in terms of recruiters, most of the recruiters are not hiding. And it's, as a former recruiter, I'd be like, oh, you want a diversity? I didn't know. I was just hiding this guy over here, but here he is. But there's a couple things. I very much understand referral networks, particularly if headhunters are mixing, because recruiters are expensive. But yeah, if a lot of stuff is coming from your referral network, you're going to get more of the same because that's what you know. I also think that I'm glad that you are posting jobs, but particularly if it doesn't sound like you are, but if you were doing recruiting straight out of law school, engaging with, so whether it be like the Black Law Students Association or Hispanic Law Students Association, and then also local minority bar associations, letting them know that you are hiring for something. But then the other thing, and this is probably not something a really small organization is going to do, but if you have some level of formal HR, there is the ability to do some direct sourcing of candidates. And if someone's not familiar with that, that can very much freak people out. But particularly for you, given that you are so savvy with LinkedIn, it is possible to search on LinkedIn and shoot a couple connection requests to people just based on their background. Hey, my firm's hiring. If you are ever interested, let me know. And I think direct outreach can actually go a long way. But oftentimes what you'll find, if you could kind of draw the Venn diagram of the places where you're posting or where you're drawing candidates from, they don't heavily overlap with the same things that diverse candidates are actually reviewing or looking at.
I think you're so right. I think you're so right, because I don't do that. I mean, I don't go to the Black organizations. I don't go to any of that. So I think that's great.
Yeah.
I love
and
that.
And oftentimes you don't have to go. Sometimes it's just a matter of finding their website and shooting them an email and saying, hey, and because they'll have, an organization will have a newsletter where they're already posting jobs and saying, hey, I would love it if you could post this open position in your next newsletter.
Done. That's an easy thing I can totally do that.
Yeah. I'm all about I'm all about saving time. So, yes.
So here's the when you say reach out, do direct outreach. I have this thing in my head that people would be offended if I just reached out to them because I want to hire a Black woman, or I want to hire someone in the LGBT community, or whatever diverse, whatever. That they're going to be offended that I do. That's not the case.
Well, so you're not going to email them and say, hey, I see that you're Black. Like, I'd love for you to apply. At the end of the day, you're hiring people, and you're endeavoring to have a diverse candidate pool in doing so. And so to send, and I'm assuming, there's certain indicators of has, coverage experience or whatever within their LinkedIn bio. And so to shoot someone, and I'm more so say shoot the request that's short versus the in-mail, because people don't fully read in-mails. Hi, my firm is hiring, looking for someone with coverage experience. If you're interested, please let me know, or if you know anyone who might be. Done. Okay. Like there's no, that just is what it is. Either they're interested or they're not.
Yeah.
But this is what a lot of large companies do. I mean, Google's directly sourcing. Apple's directly sourcing. So when it comes to, they have people whose job it is to say, hey, looked at your resume or looked at your background, you'd be great. Let me know if you want to apply to Google.
Yeah.
But when it comes to kind of us and some of the smaller organizations, particularly within legal, because legal doesn't do this, we are just like, oh, I could never, it feels nefarious. But I mean, this is what so many businesses do to find the right fit for a position.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I might try that next time. I think that's a great point.
So you have to let me know too, because you'll be like, I sent 5 messages out, but 3 responded. This is interesting. So yeah.
Listen, if I got that kind of open rate for anything I did, I think that would be great. I don't get that kind of open rate, but all right. So let's move to the how once we have a diverse pool and making sure that we are managing the talent effectively, how can small to medium firms that don't have the ability to hire a D&I professional in-house,
Yeah.
what can they do to make sure that they're
So this is actually where I think smaller organizations have a leg up, in that you are less likely to have that person sort of get lost, because in big organizations, you'll find out 6 months later or a year later, so-and-so didn't have any work to do and we just didn't notice. So I think that is beneficial, but this is likely where you may encounter implicit bias being an issue, or just other sort of cultural barriers. And it's hard because we've been talking a ton of stereotypes. I don't love doing that, but I will. So if you bring in somebody, for example, I don't know, say a Black woman, and say it's an office that is all white, there's a lot of dynamics now at play there, right? So this candidate knows, or this now employee knows, they are potentially the first Black person who's worked at your organization. There could be, whether it be something that, anybody just houses internally, or somebody within the office, in terms of extra scrutiny of the work because this person appears to be other. So really being cognizant that that person is being fairly assessed, that as much as you want to be on your toes about making sure that they feel valued and included within your organization, that they aren't being overly scrutinized. And this happens a lot. So I think it was maybe 6-7 years ago. I'm not sure if you've heard this. The research done by, oh my gosh, what's Erin Reed's company's name? Her company's escaping me. But she sent out a memo to 60 partners. And for half of them, she said this was written by a Black associate. For half, it was a white associate. The exact same memo. And they found more errors in the one written by the Black associate.
That's fascinating.
Even the Black partners found more errors in the one written by the Black associate, because just because you're a part of a given race or ethnicity or whatever doesn't mean you don't also have all kinds of bias just from being in a, for US European centric culture. So that what can sometimes happen is that person will be extra scrutinized because they're other, even if it's not intentional. And so you end up wanting to figure out ways to overcome that. And to me, the biggest way to do it is to personalize them. So if you work in a small office, get to know the person that you've hired on a personal level, but also don't expect that they are going to open up to you on day one and say, okay, well, I'm a huge fan of this. I do this. I grew up here. They're also likely going to have some walls up. Okay, why are you asking so many questions? I'm just here to do the work. But just understand, and so this isn't necessarily something that's super easy to operationalize, but you're hitting the need for human engagement, but while being aware of the fact that you have certain dynamics at play in your office, because you are a majority, say, white office. That isn't going to just mean it's a matter of hiring this person and dropping them in. They're going to need to be supported, and you're going to need to make sure that they are not being scrutinized more than would be fair for anyone. And it's the same thing also with a woman, right? And we see this. So when a woman gets hired in an all-male office, what is she subjected to sometimes, right? Is she judged because she's not one of the boys? Or is she somehow made to feel that she has to act a certain way? And so I think for a very long time, our understanding was that you needed to figure out how to conform. You're lucky to have that job, right? But that's not where we are anymore. And so we really need to figure out how to let people be themselves and still be valued and still be treated fairly. And so it's hard for me to kind of give a prescription without knowing much about a given environment, but that's going to be usually what you run into. Even if you have, if you have 12 people in your office, it's going to be a little bit easier to address it, but those are the dynamics you now have set up.
And your inherent point is very similar to a podcast that's airing very shortly with Brian Cuban, and we talked about addiction. And I asked him, as a law firm leader, what can I do? I wouldn't know how to handle someone who comes in my office and tell me they have an addiction problem. And I said, how do you handle that? He said, you need to first start by being human.
Yes.
And you need to first start with asking how their day is. How are you doing? And they're not going to say to you from day one, I'm an addict. I have a problem. You
That's
have
right.
to just keep being human and talking to them like they're a human being. And eventually they will maybe get to a point where they communicate and they're open with you. It's kind of like the same theme as
I think but the human, the connection is so important, because here's what actually happens. And at its core, to like fix all problems, it would involve everybody getting really intensive therapy, right? But that's not where we are. But what happens, and I'm pausing to see how someone would like vehemently disagree, or I could, be attacked on this, but when you are unable to be person to person with someone, that is when so either you play a script, and in some cases that script will have different biases that negatively impacts the person or your relationship. Taking the addiction issue, somebody who's having a hard time, whether it be addiction or sick, someone sick in their family, the last thing they want to do is bring it to you and then have you like spew all your personal stuff back on them. Because, sorry, I just hit my mic, so it's probably kind of loud. And we do that a lot, because when someone brings us something difficult, it triggers things in us. And we will often reflect that back. And we've learned that about humans. And so we shut down. Like, why would I share something with you that I don't personally think you can handle? And I think if I tell you, actually, you're either going to have an inappropriate level of emotion that makes me now have to do more work. Oh, it's okay. Please, Patricia, I'm fine. Like, I'm getting help. I'm going to go now. Right. So you really end up opening to people who, to sound like, a therapist or a motivational speaker, who can hold the space for you.
Yeah.
And you do that by being someone who's done a lot of their own self-work, to say, this person has come to me. This is not about me. This is about me seeing them and giving them an opportunity to feel safe and to eventually share when they are ready. But a lot of people aren't there because they're profoundly uncomfortable with things dealing to depression, suicide, race, illness. I mean, like, these are things that we are hardwired for many of us to run from. And so to ask us to sit there and let somebody else unpack that is really uncomfortable for many. And unfortunately, and I really hate to say this, but I think because many of us have a tendency to shut down that person who needs assistance in whatever form, will learn not to ask again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are great points. And I want to say, like, I think it is hard to systematize, put systems in place to deal with in a smaller law firm.
Yeah.
I want to say,
I will say, back to like the hours. So just like example, really monitor the person's hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
can they get more work? Ask them if they need more work. There's an easy one.
And I think there are some things that you can do to address the human side, because this is what I've had to do, because I get so caught up in work. If I don't have these systems in place to bring me back and try to have human conversations with people I work with, I won't do it. So we try to do, whenever I'm in the office, and I'm only in the office 2 days a week, I work from home a lot. When I'm in the office, I try to sit at the lunch table with everybody.
That's great.
Sort of having it in the office, and especially staff. I don't want them to ever think that I am a peer and unreachable.
Yeah. Which is another whole issue in large firms, by the way. There is like front of house, back of house, upstairs, downstairs.
Yes. There's we could do a whole other podcast.
Yep.
And then we do an employee function once a month. We do a charitable function once a month. And those in and of themselves have their own goals. But fundamentally, the biggest thing that I see coming out of them is coming together as a group and getting to know each other, and what the idiosyncrasies of personalities, and supporting that. Like, if you're odd, be odd, right? If you're quirky, be quirky. Like, and let's figure out how we can really support who you are and give you, the opportunity to grow as who you are.
Yep. Well, but I was also going to say, I think particularly I'll speak for, not for, but I'll speak about people of color briefly. There is a need to prove that this is a safe space for that. And I have seen, and I actually had, here's an example, not so much direct discrimination, but I do remember being told as an associate, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I remember looking back at someone and saying, well, that's not going to work for your people of color here, because we have been taught to not be the squeaky wheel. The squeaky wheel, if you're a Black woman, gets potentially the angry Black woman stereotype, gets the can't get along. So oftentimes we will not necessarily, or a person of color may not say anything in the organization until it is at a level that is absolutely intolerable, because many of us got to where we are by getting along. And so sometimes saying hey, just be comfortable here, be who you are. Okay, I heard you say that, but I'm going to need some time to see if that's in fact true.
Yeah.
So, as, a Black woman, okay, right now my hair is straight. My hair is naturally curly. Like, I choose to straighten it most of the time. But if I wear my natural hair, what's that dynamic bring? How many looks do I get? Like, is that actually welcome? I mean, there's so many things. And so the issue is really nuanced, and I'm only scratching the surface in a lot of ways. And that's the
Yeah.
other hard part about being DNI, is someone to be like, I heard her say on the podcast that I should, and it's like, maybe, yeah, but also maybe not. But I do think at the end of the day, your intent matters, but so does your impact. And I think a lot of times we just stop at intent, and we're like, but I intended well, it's not my fault that that person thought I was. You have to learn about the impact, and you learn your impact by, once again, getting to know that person and getting to a place where you can have certain discussions. And it might take 6 months, it might take a year before the person says, hey, this was great, but like that wasn't cool. And then when they tell you it wasn't cool, you have to just listen and not try to tell them why you thought it was or what you were trying to do or become defensive. Just acknowledge that was their experience. And so that, I mean, this is something that you could talk about forever, but I would say like Brene Brown, Renee Myers, like these are people who I think are excellent resources to explore that sort of thing. But so much of it becomes how comfortable we are with ourselves and how we're able to navigate working with others. But a part of it really is developing empathy and understanding that not everyone's experience is the same as yours. So back to the small firm brings in someone who's different from the norm of the firm to think that they're going to develop business exactly the same, right? For a 60-year-old, say, white male partner to think that 32-year-old woman is going to do exactly the same thing he did. I don't know. Does that make sense? Probably not. So.
And that's something I only realized about a year ago. So I have been really pushing all of the attorneys that work with me for a very long time to market this certain way, right? Yep. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And some people really excelled in it. And some people you could just tell they weren't comfortable.
Not their thing. Yep.
Not their thing. And last year I'm like, all right, I'm just going to let all of that go. I'm going to talk to them about what they like doing. What do you enjoy doing? Yep. And then just trying to support that. So now I have people marketing in very different ways. And I'm going to see how it works out. But, it was a complete mind shift to me. And it was like a click.
Yeah.
It was so weird. It was just like all of a sudden I'm like, what am I doing? He just came in my office and told me he hates speaking. Why am I... He hates speaking in public to these large audiences. I was like, you guys should go speak at this conference. You guys should go talk to like these 2,000 people. And I didn't know internally he was freaking out.
He was like,
Yeah. And I had like you said, my own script of what was going on in his head. And then thank God he was comfortable enough to come to me and say, you know what, Trisha, I just don't want to do that. I'm like, okay. And after that, I was like,
yes, there's alternatives.
Yeah. So I was like, what do you enjoy doing? And he told me, I'm like, all right, let's put fuel on that, right? Let's figure out how we can really amplify that, because if you enjoy it, I know you're going to stick with it. And if you're going to stick with it, consistency in the long game is going to win hands down.
Absolutely.
But it was only recent for me. And I think maybe doing that on other aspects of how you run your business and how you handle and manage employees, whether attorneys, staff, whatever it may be, would be helpful.
There's a profound level, I think, of self-awareness and humility in that. And I think oftentimes leaders wrongly are taught that those aren't things that they should really have a lot of. So I think, kudos to you for identifying that, but the ability to say, hey, I was wrong, or I thought about this, and we always are going to have to keep changing and learning so that we can really get the most out of others and for ourselves. I mean, I don't know, I could talk about this kind of like introspective self-awareness stuff all day long, because I think all roads lead to that, whether you're talking leadership, you're talking D&I, you're talking business development, in one form or another, it's all the same thing. Yeah. Which, once again, back to LinkedIn, our connection. And that's what I tend to talk the most about, are the things that all kind of, link to this human connection, self-awareness, self-esteem sort of land.
Well, I have a lot of takeaways that I'm going to go back and I'm going to think about my processes, some of them which I don't even have processes, but I'm going to think about them and see what I can do to implement So, but this has been so helpful. So just on closing thoughts, give one or two takeaways or comments or feedback, whatever you want to do, to law firm leaders on what they can do for better diversity and inclusion.
Oh, wow. One or two. Let's see. So ultimately, I think the D&I inquiry is one that starts with yourself. And so if there are things that you are uncomfortable with or don't fully understand about you, I always think that's a place to start, particularly as a leader, because these are the discussions your organization is going to need to have. And if you are not comfortable exploring them, that does not bode well for the discussion. But ultimately, I think there's kind of a two-pronged approach to D&I. Yes, what can you systematize? What can you take out of the land of potential bias? So whether that be having work allocation systems or looking at the systems behind your recruiting, but then there is a place for these broader kind of cultural discussions, and that is where, say, bringing in, if you can, say, an outside consultant to lead something, or having a book that everyone in the office is reading and that you talk about. Although one thing I did not mention, which is really important before we go, so traditional D&I programs won't work unless your culture is in a certain place. So for some organizations, it's about taking a real sober look at yourself and figuring out where there's problems and starting more of a culture change than it necessarily being D&I. And then also, I really like to just talk in terms of people and talent. I could talk all day about diversity and inclusion and never say diversity and inclusion. So I think that's another perspective to have. Understand your D&I issues as a talent-related issue, a leadership issue. It can be a way to frame it that is more compelling to some. And then at the end of the day, recognize that for many, you also have a client issue. And when you put it like that, suddenly a lot more people are on board. But ultimately, I really think it's something that's a long road for all of us. So pick something small. Pick one little thing to start with. Give it 6 months. Give it a year. Pick another thing next year. This is not something that any of us are waving a magic wand and being like, oh, fixed it. And if so, I would not be here. I would not have a job. But I will say that as a closing remark, that is the fun part of my job, is I have a job where the whole goal is to put myself out of business. So I appreciate having a job with, I guess, like a moral purpose. But yeah, and thank you so much for having me. One day we should just talk about LinkedIn though, because that's what we really like to talk about.
I know. I'm obsessed, and it's not healthy. It's so not healthy.
You and me both, though. You and me both.
Well, where can people find you? Two things, two closing questions. One, give us a resource or a book recommendation for anybody who wants to learn more about and then tell people where they can find you.
Okay, so my book recommendations will be slightly non-traditional or untraditional. So I think Brene Brown's Dare to Lead is fantastic. Get it, read it. It applies to everything. It also applies to diversity and inclusion. For women, I think What Works for Women at Work by Joan Williams. Another great book that, as I said earlier, will be really, I think, affirming of your experience and give you some tactics as well. And then in terms of where to find me, as we've said multiple times, LinkedIn. So just Alexis Robertson at LinkedIn, and then I'm at Foley and Lardner. So you'll know me if you find me. I'm pretty easy to spot. So.
Well, I super appreciate you coming on. We're going to have to revisit the topic
yes.
or just come on and talk about, like you said, LinkedIn. But I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Until the next time on the Defense Never Rests, we will see you then.